President, Senators, I understand, I'm told we have around 27 minutes, but I will return all of that, but perhaps 5 back to you. There's just a few things that I need to address, and so in an extraordinary and perhaps unprecedented act of self-restraint on my part, I will resist the opportunity to rebut every single false and illogical thing that you just heard, and I am going to be able to return to you, perhaps 22 or 23 minutes. Few points. One, we have definitely made some progress in the last few days, because a few days ago, the president's team, although I think it was perhaps a member who has since left the team, lectured us that this was not an insurrection and said that the impeachment managers were outrageous in using the word insurrection. Today, counsel in his closing statement said it was a violent insurrection, and he denounced it. And I would certainly love to see President Trump also call it a violent insurrection and denounce it too. And I believe, although I don't have a verbatim text, that counsel called for long sentences for the people who were involved. Again, I would love to hear that come from the president as well. The distinguished counsel complains that there's no precedent with the developed body of law that the Senate has for impeaching and convicting a president who incites violent insurrection against the Congress and the government of the United States. Well, I suppose that's true because it never occurred to any other president of the United States, from George Washington to John Adams to Thomas Jefferson to James Madison to James Monroe to Abraham Lincoln to Ronald Reagan, to George W. Bush, to Barack Obama, to incite a violent insurrection against the Union. You're right, we've got no precedent for that. And so they think that that somehow is a mark in their favor. That's a score for them. That this Senate has to be the first one to define incitement of violent insurrection against the Union. And so the gentleman puts it on me. He says, inciting a president for committing incitement to violent insurrection against the Union is the new Raskin doctrine. We've tried to convince him that there are well-known principles and elements of incitement which we have talked to you about ad nauseum, and that this is an intrinsically, inherently fact-based judgment. But if that is the Raskin doctrine, that a president of the United States cannot incite violent insurrection against the Union and the Congress, then I embrace it, and I take it as an honor. Most law professors never even get a doctrine named after them. So I will accept that. And finally, the counsel goes back to Julian Bond's case, because I think in the final analysis, their best argument, as pathetically weak as it is really about the First Amendment. But remember, they keep talking about stifling President Trump's speech. Someone tell me when his speech has ever been stifled. He says exactly what he wants, whenever he wants. If and when you convict him for incitement of insurrection, he will continue to say whatever he wants on that day. Remember, they referred yesterday to interference with his liberty, which I found absolutely bizarre, because everybody knows that he will not spend 1 minute in prison or jail from conviction on these charges. It is a civil remedy to protect all of us, to protect the entire country, our children, our Constitution, our future. That's what impeachment, trial, conviction are all about. Julian Bond. See, I knew Julian Bond, so forgive me. Most people say, don't even respond to this stuff. I got to respond to this, okay? Julian Bond was a civil rights activist who decided to go into politics, like the people in this room, like all of us who are in politics. And they tried to keep him out. He was a member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which really launched the voting rights movement in America. It's a great story that Bob Moses tells in his book called Radical Equations about, he was a graduate student in mathematics at Harvard, and he went down to Mississippi. You know why? Because he saw a picture in the New York Times of black civil rights protesters, college students, I think in North Carolina, AT&T, and he saw a picture of them on the cover of the New York Times, and they were sitting in at a lunch counter, and he looked at the picture and he said, they looked the way that I felt. They looked the way that I felt, and he said he had to go down south to Mississippi, and they launched the voting rights movement. That's where the phrase "one person, one vote" comes from. It was not invented by the Supreme Court. They would go door to door to try to register people to vote. But anyway, Julian Bond was part of that movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, nonviolence. It was the end and it was the means, nonviolence. And he ran for the state legislature in Georgia, a path other civil rights activists followed, like our great late beloved colleague John Lewis, who's in our hearts today. And when he got elected, they wanted to try to keep him from being sworn into the Georgia legislature. And so they said, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is taking a position against the Vietnam War. You're a member of SNCC. We're not going to admit you because you took a position against the Vietnam War. And the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, said you cannot prevent someone from swearing an oath to become a member of a legislative body because of a position that they took or a group they were a part of took before they got sworn in. That's the exact opposite of Donald Trump. He got elected to office. He swore an oath to the Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. He served as president for 4 years, right up until the end, when he wanted to exercise his rights under the imaginary January exception, and he incited a violent mob and insurrection to come up here, and we all know what happened. He is being impeached and convicted for violating his oath of office that he took. He's not being prevented from taking his oath in the first place. The First Amendment's on our side. He tried to overturn the will of the people, the voice of the people. He lost that election by more than 7 million votes. Some people don't want to admit it. Counsel for the president could not bring themselves to admit that the election's over. In answer to the question from the distinguished gentleman from Vermont, he refused to answer that. He said it was irrelevant, despite all of the evidence you've heard about the big lie and how that set the stage for his incitement of the insurrectionary violence against us. First Amendment is on our side. We are defending the Bill of Rights. We are defending the constitutional structure. We are defending the separation of powers. We're defending the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House against a president who acted no better than a marauder and a member of that mob by inciting those people to come here. And in many ways, he was worse. He named the date, he named the time, and he brought them here, and now he must pay the price. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin.
Mr. President.
The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. President, the Senate is now ready to vote on the article of impeachment. And after that is done, we will adjourn the court of impeachment.
The clerk will read the article of impeachment.
Article 1, incitement of an insurrection.
Senate will be in order.
The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Further, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits any person who has engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States from holding any office under the United States. in his conduct while President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath, faithfully to execute the office of the President of the United States and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald John Trump engaged in high crimes and misdemeanors by inciting violence against the government of the United States in that, on January 6, 2021, pursuant to the 12th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the House of Representatives, and the Senate met at the United States Capitol for a joint session of Congress to count the votes of the Electoral College. In the months preceding the joint session, President Trump repeatedly issued false statements asserting that the presidential election results were the product of widespread fraud and should not be accepted by the American people or certified by state or federal officials. Shortly before the joint session commenced, President Trump addressed a crowd at the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. There he reiterated false claims that we won this election and we won it by a landslide. He also willfully made statements that in context encouraged and foreseeably resulted in lawless action at the Capitol, such as, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Thus incited by President Trump, members of the crowd he had addressed in an attempt to, among other objectives, interfere with the joint session's solemn constitutional duty to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election, unlawfully breached and vandalized the Capitol, injured and killed law enforcement personnel, menaced members of Congress, the Vice President, and congressional personnel, and engaged in other violent, deadly, destructive, and seditious acts. President Trump's conduct on January 6, 2021, followed his prior efforts to subvert and obstruct the certification of the results of the 2020 presidential election. Those prior efforts included a phone call on January 2, 2021, during which President Trump urged the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, to find enough votes to overturn the Georgia presidential election results and threatened security Raffensperger if he failed to do so. In all this, President Trump gravely endangered the security of the United States and its institutions of government. He threatened the integrity of the democratic system, interfered with the peaceful transition of power, and imperiled a co-equal branch of government. He therefore betrayed his trust as president to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, Donald John Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security, democracy, and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-government and the rule of law. Donald John Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States, and demand that you, the said Donald John Trump, should be put to answer the accusations as set forth in this article, and that such proceedings, examinations, trials, and judgments might be thereupon had as are agreeable to law and justice.
Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place, and they'll vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules of Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution, regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment, provides that, quote, no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present, close quote. The question is on the article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent Donald John Trump guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required, and the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, guilty. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley.
Not guilty.
Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Mr. Haggerty.
Not guilty.
Mr. Haggerty, not guilty. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley.
Not guilty.
Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Height-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Height-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kelly.
Guilty.
Mr. Kelly, guilty. Mr. Kennedy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King.
Guilty.
Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy.
Guilty.
Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, guilty. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, not guilty. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, not guilty. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, guilty. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, guilty. Mr. Padilla.
Guilty.
Mr. Padilla, guilty. Mr. Paul.
Not guilty.
Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Peters.
Guilty.
Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed.
Guilty.
Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Romney.
Guilty.
Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan.
Not guilty.
Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, guilty. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, not guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, guilty. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty. Why we have these things? Unless you had a script.
Yep. Yep. The yeas are 57. The nays are 43. Two-thirds of the senators present not having voted guilty. The Senate judges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, upon one article of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and two-thirds of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charge contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby, acquitted of the charge in said article.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, I send an order to the desk.
And the clerk will report.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the article against Donald John Trump, adjourn sine die.
And without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned sine die. And could I have order, please? The presiding officer, the acting sergeant at arms will escort the House managers out of the Senate chamber.